Greetings to everyone. As Director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, I am delighted to welcome you for another afternoon with us, Fireside Chat with Professor Surya P. Subedi, and together with Patricia Galvo-Atelis, my cohort in organizing these webinar series of distinguished speakers of international law. And may I just say that Professor Subedi meets all the criteria of being a truly illustrious speaker and a distinguished scholar and practitioner of international law. Really, someone of his caliber, not enough time to go through everything he has done. But just some examples. Professor Subedi is Officer of the Order of the British Empire. He was appointed King's Counsel, and also the very prestigious appointment of Doctor of Civil Law by Oxford University. So in addition to that, Professor Subedi was appointed as Special Rapporteur for the United Nations for Human Rights for Cambodia in 2009. He has many publications, and really his breadth of areas of expertise in international law range from law of the sea, water law, human rights, and also international investment law. He's also a member of the very prestigious Institut de Droit International. And his most recent book, and I think that our lecture today will be taken from that, is entitled Human Rights and Eastern Civilizations. So I'm really, Patricia and I are very excited and very much looking forward to listening to the lecture today, a very important topic, I think, particularly as we look at the global context today of cultural relativism, the values of Eastern civilizations, and the universality of human rights. Professor Subedi, it's our great pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to you and listen to your lecture, which later on we'll follow up with some questions and interaction with the audience.
Thank you. Good afternoon and namaste and hello to all of you in Singapore and joining from other parts of the world. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Nilufar Oral, a good friend of mine, for her very generous words of introduction, and would like to thank her and other members of the Center for International Law at the University of Singapore for inviting me this afternoon to share my thoughts on this topic. It is an immense honor and a pleasure for me to join you all to share my thoughts. And also I would like to thank Jerry for organizing this event so efficiently. I have been in touch with her for a couple of weeks. And I would like to thank all other members, staff members and academic members of the Center of International Law at the University of Singapore. I was glad to accept this invitation to speak on this topic, since I recently have published, as Professor Oral mentioned, a book on a similar topic, human rights in Eastern civilizations, which basically looks at how cross-fertilization of values between the Eastern and Western civilizations has taken place. There has been a great deal of debate in the recent past about decolonizing the curriculum in universities around the globe, and a call for the use of more inclusive and diverse sources for teaching. I examine the values of Eastern civilizations and their contribution to the development of the United Nations Human Rights Agenda. When discussing human rights, I am not only referring to human rights in the modern sense of the term, that is, the human rights developed mainly after the establishment of the United Nations and within the framework of Western political thought. Rather, I examine human rights in a wider sense and in a much earlier historical context. I focus on the norms underpinning Eastern philosophies to assess the extent to which the ancient civilizations of the East already had human rights values embedded in them. Here, I would like to make a distinction between human rights values and human rights. What I am referring to mostly this afternoon, human rights values that actually underpin human rights that we know today under the auspices of the United Nations. International human rights law literature and United Nations human rights reports and publications are replete with assertions that human rights are universal. However, the question is how universal these human rights actually are. What is the basis of the assertion of the universality of human rights? Are they universal because the Universal Declaration says so, or because the Declaration and the core international human rights treaties have received near universal acceptance? Do they emanate from all major civilizations and all major religions of the world to qualify as universal values? And if so, what contributions have the Eastern civilizations, mainly Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, made to the universality of human rights? Since Asia is home to all major religions of the world, including Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, all of them must be included within the term Eastern civilizations. 600 years before the Magna Carta was adopted, the Prophet Muhammad drafted the Charter of Medina, which contained more progressive human rights principles than the Magna Carta. All major religions and spiritual ideas came from the East, and in my opinion, some of them became Western in due course. The early civilization that grew in the Fertile Crescent reached its pinnacle initially in Babylon and later in Persia, and produced two early documents of immense historical significance: the Code of Hammurabi and the Charter of Cyrus. These two documents contain the early elements of human rights. When the people from this region migrated in various phases, both east to the Hindu Kush region, the Indus Valley, and ultimately the Gangetic Plains, and west to Greece and Rome, they carried with them the values of the Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations. Thus, these two historical documents seem to have influenced the values of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity when they flourished in the Middle East, from where Christianity spread further west and northwest, ultimately covering much of Europe. In an article on the origins of human rights written for the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2015, Greg Dory states that, quote, human rights are sometimes portrayed as a Western concept or invention, usually most vociferously by those committing the most serious violations. This is in fact a misreading of centuries of history, which led to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Way back in 539 BC, the armies of Cyrus the Great, the first king of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, conquered the city of Babylon. In doing so, as he prepared to govern his new territory, he declared that slaves would be free. People had the right to choose their own religion, and that different races living in the city would be treated equally, unquote. Turning to Hinduism and Buddhism, quite early on in antiquity, that is in the mid-1st millennium BC, the East experienced a frenzy of intellectual activity due to the birth of different philosophies of life and social organization, including experiments in the organization of states. This was the time of the Middle Way, nirvana, non-violence, and yoga, preached by Buddha and Krishna. The formulation of the Jain code of conduct by Nataputta, known as Mahavira, and the reorientation of the Vedic philosophies through the Bhagavad Gita by Krishna. All of these developments of the mid-first millennium BC had a lasting impact on the lives of the people of the East, shaping the religious and philosophical discourse to this day and influencing thinkers beyond the East, such as those in ancient Greece. When belief in the traditional Vedic values and way of life declined, Krishna, Buddha, and Mahavira came up with their own philosophies of life and interpretation and a reorientation of the Vedic values and shaped the religious and philosophical discourse accordingly. Even the debate on forms of government was already underway in the East in antiquity. The thinkers and philosophers of the time, such as Buddha, explored alternatives to monarchical authority and proposed alternative state systems with very different constitutions. The people in the Asian civilizations that had developed along the Indus, Ganges, and the Huanghe River basins were initially worshippers of the forces of nature, similar to other ancient civilizations. They all belonged to one religion. Gradually, the civilization around these rivers, which were evolving simultaneously and independently of each other, also became more sophisticated. Their philosophers started to question traditional patterns of thinking and develop new ideas to manage society better and to address the sufferings of the people. It was in the Indus and the Ganges river basins that the early religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, flourished. Buddhism was gradually adopted in much of Asia. It was taken to China from the passes in the Hindu Kush region along the Nepalese Himalayas. And from there, it spread rapidly both within China and to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Hinduism likewise spread throughout much of South and Southeast Asia, thereby making Buddhism and Hinduism the main Asian religions. The civilization that flourished in the Hindu Kush region, the Indus Valley, and the Gangetic Plains came to be known as the Hindu civilization, and its major offshoot is Buddhism, which influenced indigenous beliefs and religions across Asia, such as Confucianism in China and Shintoism in Japan. Thus, the root of all major religions east of Persia, modern-day Iran, is, in my opinion, Hinduism, which in turn has its roots in the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Zoroastrian belief systems. In fact, the Indus Valley, now in modern-day Pakistan, is where both Hinduism and Buddhism flourished, while the prevailing religions in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Malaysia today may be Islam, they have a strong Hindu-Buddhist heritage, including temples and religious and ancient artifacts. In the recent past, both Pakistan and Indonesia have decided to unearth and revive the traces of their Buddhist heritage, with a view not only to promoting tourism, but also to preserving their cultural heritage. Bangladesh is another country with a predominantly Muslim population, but whose culture, language, and tradition are very much rooted in Hinduism. Even Japanese Hinduism was influenced by Buddhism, which in turn was influenced by Hinduism. Therefore, the source of all major religions of the East proper is the main Hindu religious scripture known as the Rig Veda. It has generally been submitted by both Western and Eastern scholars that the current version of the Rig Veda was composed in approximately 1450 BC. It was followed by the composition of 3 other Vedas and mainly Upanishads. Indeed, there are some similarities between the works of Plato and Hindu scriptures regarding matters such as the immortality of the soul and the organization of society along the lines of class according to a caste system. Plato speaks of 3 social classes: the perfect guardians, the auxiliary guardians, and the third class. The status of the perfect guardians resembles that held by the Brahmins in Hinduism. The status held by the auxiliary guardians of Plato resembles the status of the Kshatriyas, the second highest caste in Hinduism. These 2 classes of guardians were supposed to rule in unison, which is similar to how the Brahmins and Kshatriyas rule over the Hindu world for a long time. The third class resembles the third Hindu caste of Vaishyas. I mean, the third class in Plato's work resembles the third Hindu caste of the Vaishyas, those people who work in agriculture, in the trades, in commerce, and in the service sector. However, the main difference between the 2 systems is that Plato's third class encompasses everybody apart from those in the intellectual classes, that is the perfect guardians and the auxiliary guardians, while in Hinduism a 4th caste exists, which mainly comprises people who do menial jobs in the service sector. When the Aryans conceived the caste system, they did so on the basis of the color of the skin and the profession of the people. Thus, the aboriginal non-Aryans of darker skin were initially put in the 4th caste. But when the caste system was recognized later, they were integrated into all 4 castes, depending on their profession and heritage. Slaves were not acknowledged as being part of the social hierarchy of Hinduism, and likewise are not mentioned as a class in the works of Plato either. They are thought of as mere appendages to other classes. The Brahmins who work to interpret Dharma are a class of their own, which is higher than that of the ruling classes known as Kshatriyas. The latter have no freedom. Basically, the rulers, the kings, have no freedom to deny others the freedoms that they enjoy under the scriptures in accordance with Sanatana Dharma. The ruling classes would be in violation of their own Dharma if they unduly intervene in the personal lives of individuals and would be held accountable for it. The Dharma or duty of kings or rulers is to preserve order by ensuring the performance of the Dharma of one and all. The state is expected to follow a laissez-faire approach when governing, intervening in people's lives, only when things begin to break down. How the state should conduct itself vis-a-vis its citizens is regulated by the notion of Dharma, which in this context can be equated to the modern idea of the rule of law. There is no credible evidence to suggest that Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle was influenced by the scriptures of Eastern civilizations. However, it is possible that the cultures of ancient South Asia were studied by ancient Western civilizations. Western philosophers of the classical Greek and Roman periods would have known how the ancient states of South Asia were governed, because there is evidence of interaction between peoples living along the fertile Indus Valley and the Gangetic Plains and the Greeks and the Romans. One plausible scenario which accounts for cultural similarities between the East and the West is that both Eastern and Western philosophers came up with similar ideas about the organization of society simultaneously, but perhaps independently of each other, and that their ideas were informed by each civilization's heritage. For example, Kautilya, the author of the Arthashastra, was a contemporary of Aristotle, and the detailed rules prescribed for different classes or castes represented in the Arthashastra are also present in the earlier scripture, namely the Manusmriti. These rules have many similarities with the laws of Plato. However, both the Arthashastra and the Manusmriti clearly mention and are influenced by much earlier Hindu scriptures, including the Rig Veda. The modern concept of human rights requires the state or those who exercise public authority to protect the rights of an individual. The Hindu concept of dharma does the same by requiring the king or the state and all other members of society to do the same for each other. Each person, therefore, has his or her own dharma or duty, known as Swadharma. Some duties are common to all, but when it comes to specific duties, what is correct for a woman, according to dharma, might not be correct for a man. What is correct for an adult might not be so for a child, and so on. Thus, in Hinduism, people do not live under public laws per se, but they have a dharma or duty or responsibility towards each other, including the protection of personal property. Thus, the Hindu and the Buddhist idea of human rights was conceived in a wide context, and the exercise of rights depends on following one's duties vis-a-vis other people, society at large, and the environment. In other words, one must earn through good conduct, one must earn rights through good conduct, which is embodied in the notion of dharma. Ritter, a distinguished scholar, explains that in Hinduism, the following applies, quote, right action is a function of one's duty to act in accordance with dharma, a duty that encompasses all behavior towards self, family, society, humanity, and divinity. Hindu rights thus derive from duty. The fulfillment of one's duty to act in accordance with dharma generates rights appropriate to the status acquired by having acted rightly, unquote. Thus, in my opinion, the main difference between Eastern and Western traditions is the manner in which one acquires rights. In Western thinking, human rights are acquired through the declaration or proclamation of rights, using a legal or political instrument. But these rights are inherent in human beings because of their status as human beings. In Hinduism and Buddhism, rights are earned by good conduct or adherence to dharma or dhamma. Justice Veeramantri, a former justice and vice president of the International Court of Justice, explains as follows, quote, some of the world's great expositions of the infinite value of the human personality is in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam are set in a background that stresses duties rather than rights. Every human being is vested with certain duties, and upon their due performance depends the well-being not only of himself but of society. The notion of rights had no independent existence, but rested upon a bedrock of duty. The concept of rights is opposed to duties unfolded, however, against a specific social and historical background which was peculiar to the West. In relation to the consequence of rights, both Eastern and Western civilizations have adopted a similar approach according to the standards of each era. The Rig Veda gives us an indication that the Vedic society had embraced matriarchy and entrusted women with their responsibilities and leadership, both at home and in the affairs of the state, including war. The Deepavali or Diwali in popular parlance mainly involves worshipping of Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity. Goddess Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom and intellect, is worshipped on the day children are introduced to education and annually thereafter. The core of Buddhist teaching is non-violence. And this core is shared in the Upanishads, the Hindu scriptures, and the Vaishnava and Shaiva sects within Hinduism. Buddha shunned violence, and Krishna justified violence only as a defensive measure to be taken to uphold righteousness or to right a wrong. Offensive violence also is rejected in Hindu polity. Non-violence is the first and foremost principle which aims to protect the right to life of people and is perhaps, in my opinion, a number one human right. Buddhism sought to protect this right from the very beginning. Most of the human rights cannot be exercised properly in a violent society. Thus, non-violence is the bedrock of human rights and is a central pillar of both Hinduism and Buddhism. An analysis of the scriptures of the East demonstrates that Hinduism and Buddhism did not teach about human rights as we understand them today. However, both laid foundational principles for human rights and the conditions under which people can enjoy them. Tolerance, pluralism, secularism, personal liberty, inclusivity, and non-violence are key principles that are deeply entrenched in these Eastern belief systems. These values played a major role in ushering the countries of Asia out of colonial rule and foreign subjugation, and have found their expression in various international human rights instruments. Although the perceived wisdom is that Western values ultimately found their expression in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, many of these Western values themselves have their roots in Eastern civilizations. It is, of course, debatable whether Western notions of human rights have influenced Eastern ideas or vice versa in later periods. Alexander Witch, the historian of the law of nations, argues that it was the tolerant and secular practices of the East that influenced the West. Let me quote him. The European agencies in the East learned the lesson of coexistence of Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity in India, particularly on the West Coast, and transplanted their experience to the West, which had been so long incapable of extricating itself from the obsession of religious wars, unquote. It can be submitted that the practice of tolerance in the East has had an impact on the West and on the evolution of the concept of human rights. Justice Veeramantri also states that Hindu philosophy is older than the Greek and Chinese, and that it is well accepted from linguistic evidence that Sanskrit, the ancient classical and sacred language of the Hindus, in which the Vedas were composed, is the oldest known member of the Indo-European family of languages, unquote. In his analysis, Justice Veeramantri cites scholars from the West and suggests that Hindu philosophy was one of the main springs of philosophical ideas of the Greeks. It's not only Justice Veeramantri, number of Western scholars have also come to the same conclusion that the one of the main springs of the philosophical ideas of the Greeks was Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Veeramantri also argued that cultures such as the Hindu Vedic Aryan culture were already old when ancient Greek civilization was still in its infancy. When Socrates, the renowned thinker and philosopher who helped to found the culture of Western civilization, was sharing his ideas with his students such as Plato. And when Plato wrote classic works such as the Republic and the Laws, Hindu civilization was already well advanced. And both Buddha and Krishna had already imparted their philosophies of life through the Tripitaka, a Buddhist scripture, and the Bhagavad Gita, Hindu scripture, respectively, which it is argued are based on the much older Vedas and Upanishad. As I said earlier, the Rig Veda going back to 1450 BC. Therefore, in my view, the values inherent in both Hinduism and Buddhism have had a profound direct and indirect impact on those thinkers and philosophers around the globe who had a universal outlook and who were willing to learn from and be inspired by the values of societies beyond their own. These processes in turn contributed directly or indirectly to the adoption of the modern agenda of human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those who claim that the notion of human rights is purely a product of Western Christian civilization are projecting reductionist 19th century values, the values of the peak of colonial domination, onto the past. They do not take into account the philosophical and spiritual developments that have taken place prior to colonization. Likewise, the idea of cultural relativism has been advanced in an attempt to undermine the universality of human rights. Each society, of course, is different from other societies. However, this does not mean that the core values of humanity differ from one society to another, from one culture to another, or from one religion to another. Western philosophical thought places emphasis on rights, as I said earlier, and Eastern philosophy places emphasis on duties, as embodied in the Hindu notion of dharma and Buddhist equivalent dhamma. The significance of certain values and directions of thought may vary in different societies. Individualism and the notion of individual rights in Western thought became more prevalent as the advanced countries became increasingly prosperous. This economic prosperity allowed individuals to stand on their own feet and free themselves from their wider family and social obligations. Eastern societies, on the other hand, have not quite reached a similar level of economic development. Consequently, Eastern societies are still less individualistic and do not put individual rights before social duties and family duties. Eastern societies remain family-oriented and society-oriented. They value mutual support and dependence. The duty of care to others and to nature and the natural world is also derived from the notion of dharma in Hinduism and dhamma in Buddhism. As I have tried to demonstrate this afternoon, the core of human rights values also have strong roots in Hinduism and Buddhism. This shared cultural heritage, integrating Eastern and Western thinking, adds further legitimacy to the universality of human rights and demonstrates how beneficial principles from Christian and non-Christian heritage can come together to further the advancement of human civilization. The same is true for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which embodies the values of both, in my opinion, Christian and non-Christian civilizations, including Hinduism and Buddhism. Therefore, the claim that human rights are values of the West alone ignores the origins of human rights. Likewise, the relativist or Asian values argument advanced by the autocratic and semi-autocratic leaders of Asia, in my opinion, has no basis in the cultural, moral, and philosophical foundations of Asian countries. I would like to thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Subedi, for that truly enlightening, really was, lecture, where you really took us from back to the times of Babylon, Sumerians, until present time, looking at it through the eyes and the lens of human rights. And I have to say, I learned a great deal from you today, and it made me think quite a bit as well, because I myself, coming from an Eastern, Turkish culture, Islamic culture, were raised in the sense as if everything started from the West, but that's not true. Absolutely. And you mentioned the Charter of Medina from the Prophet Muhammad. I know that, from the Ottoman Empire, which is always vilified in the West, it was a tradition of tolerance, religious tolerance. So I think that everything you've said is so important in the influence that the Eastern philosophies, religions, and cultures have had over the centuries, going back to ancient Greece, and that. And it's about values. It's interesting the point you made, the difference between duties and rights, the individualism. But here we are in the 21st century, where human rights is very much associated with Western, sometimes Christian, but Western values. And I'm going to let Patricia also pipe in here, but I have to say, I want to start off with, so how do we change that? Because it's not the reality. You're absolutely right. And you talked about the decolonization of the curriculum, but shall we say, it's not even just the colonization, countries that were not colonized, but still under the influence. How do we change that perception? Because it's not correct. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more that this notion that human rights started with European values, and it's important, it's not to undermine that at all, but it really negates a whole history that you've so succinctly and thoughtfully given to us in a very short period of time, because we're talking about centuries. So that's my question, but I want to turn over to Patricia, who may also have some thoughts here. And then to our audience, you're welcome to write on the chat any questions you have on this absolutely wonderful lecture we had today.
Shall I answer your question, Niloufar, before I proceed to Patricia?
Okay, why don't we do that then?
Yes, thank you for your very kind words about my presentation this afternoon. Well, when the Black Lives Matter campaign began in the United States, there were some other movements underway around the globe. And one of them was to decolonize the curriculum at universities around the globe. Decolonizing the curriculum does not mean excluding or removing some of the material already in use. What it means, in my opinion, including more sources, so that people are exposed to much wider historical, cultural, religious context. So it becomes a more rounded understanding of human rights or Western political thought. So one way of doing it would be continuing to give the momentum to the idea of decolonizing the curriculum, meaning including more sources in the curriculum at universities around the globe. That would be one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, continuing to hammer the message home that the values of the Western civilization basically that took a shape, in my opinion, mostly during the colonial period. People have been projecting it onto the past, and as if things did not exist, values did not exist, nothing was happening until the colonization period, is wrong. There were other societies, for instance, in the South and Southeast Asia, Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, all these Eastern civilizations, much more advanced at the time. When Aristotle was writing his work, Plato was doing the same thing. There were other contemporaries like Kautilya writing his Arthashastra. So they must have had some interaction that time. Only during the later period, I think from the 6th and 7th century BC, the level of interaction was diminished. But prior to that, there was active interaction between the philosophers of the East and the West. So they must have had some interaction and thereby influence in each other's way of thinking when they were developing their own global outlook. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Patricia.
Yes, no, I want to join Niloufar in thanking you, Professor Subedi, for this really fascinating time travel in a way, and really trying to explain and demystify these ideas that, as Niloufar said, sometimes we have that human rights is a Western concept or a product of Western philosophy, and I think sometimes that you know, in today's time, sometimes that can also be a source of certain pushback that we see in certain parts of the world with regard to human rights and to the idea of universality of human rights because they might be associated with Western values and origin. I wanted to, maybe come back a bit. I mean, you've mentioned, of course, and it's impossible not to, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as the centerpiece of a common understanding of the universal values that underpin human rights, and one of the, I mean, I think it's the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was a unique moment in history also, where representatives of different countries came together and produced this monumental declaration that probably, if today was to be negotiated, would not be as as balanced and as reflective of the universal human values that I think it does. Of course, the world was very different at the time, because in between 46 and 48, when the declaration was negotiated, the world was quite different than it is today, in the sense that African countries had not yet been decolonized, attained independence, and many Asian countries also. And so also sometimes that may add to that idea that because it was before the colonization, it's reflective still of the colonizing values. But indeed, I mean, there was extensive participation by Eastern delegates, and not just, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt as the president of the Commission on Human Rights and the negotiations, but also delegates from around the world, and really trying to bring together those notions of that are common to humanity all over the world. But maybe one point that I think your presentation focused more on the individual liberties and what we call today the civil and political rights. My question would be also if you would apply the same kind of reasoning also to economic, social, and cultural rights, which are also, of course, a very important dimension of human rights, and of course we hear this always the reference to the indivisibility and the interdependence of human rights, and the important relation between economic, social, cultural rights and also civil and political rights. And then I may have a follow-up question, but I see that there's maybe something in the Q&A. But if there isn't more questions, you mentioned something also about the rights of the natural world and the rights of nature. And also I wanted to ask if we can we expect that we're moving next step towards recognizing the rights of nature, also as a reflection of this universal value. So thank you so much again for a very, very stimulating presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Patricia, for your very kind words. I fully agree with you that when we do not challenge the notion that human rights are the product of the Western Christian polity, then it becomes easier for people advocating the idea of Asian values to say we are different, than introducing the notion of cultural relativism or geographical regional relativism and trying to undermine the rights of the people in the countries concerned. Therefore, the idea that human rights are Western values, number one, is wrong, and number two, not helpful for advancing the universality of human rights. When Professor Nilufar mentioned my work in Cambodia in her very generous introduction, the special rapporteur for the country, when I went there, I was confronted by some political leaders saying that you have come to promote a Western human rights agenda, isn't it? Then I challenged that one and say, look, if you look at the words written on the walls of Angkor Wat, actually there you can see how Buddhism and Hinduism came together to advance a Khmer civilization. And some of the observations that I presented to you this afternoon you can see, you can actually read on the walls of the Angkor Wat temples. There are thousands of temples. Then when I mentioned that in your own heritage, human rights were embedded already in the values of Khmer civilization. Of course, there were some harsh regimes, dictatorial regimes in the past, but so far as the religious scriptures are concerned, your own cultural heritage, your own religious heritage says that human rights was part of the Cambodian civilization or Khmer civilization, that they had no answer to give to me. So that's how I would like to see, because these days, especially in the run-up to the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, there was quite a sort of momentum there, especially in Southeast Asia, saying that we Asians are different. So we have, our own cultural, sort of values. They are not necessarily consistent with Western values. Directly or indirectly, they were advancing the idea that some autocratic rule can be justified by saying that one. That also I want to challenge. No, the heritage in the distant past of all Asian countries, including, as Niloufar said, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish civilization, all that part of the world had human rights values embedded in them. Therefore, the idea of Asian values and these values being different from Western values was advanced that time with a view to supporting the autocratic rule in some parts of Asia. That has to be challenged to ensure that the human rights become truly universal, and there is no ideological challenge to the universality of human rights. Implementation is a different thing, because as you rightly said, Patricia, not only social, civil and political rights, but also economic, social and cultural rights. That also implementation of those rights depends on the state of economic development of a country concerned. But so far as Hinduism and Buddhism are concerned, personal liberty meant also economic freedom. Once a person could enjoy personal liberty, that was not limited to civil and political liberty. That also implied economic liberty as well, to engage in economic activities. Therefore, if you see in the Hindu world, especially in Asia, and especially in India with 1.4 billion population, wow, people are free to exercise, worship any god they want to, go to any temple they want to, believe in anything they want to. Such a diverse country, because it is possible, although many people thought when India became independent, it will be an ungovernable country with so many sort of diversity, cultural, religious, linguistic, racial diversity, but it has held together. Why it has held together? Because people have immense freedom to enjoy what they want to enjoy. Their personal liberty is protected by religion. It's deeply entrenched in the psyche of the people. Doesn't matter what the laws are passed by the government in New Delhi or in Kathmandu in Nepal or in other parts of the world. People rely on their religious scripture and they say, I'm entitled to do the following according to my dharma. That governments cannot challenge. That's what should be done. So in much of Asia and elsewhere, people are entitled to their rights proclaimed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights instruments. It was already part of their cultural religious heritage. If we can convey that message, then it will be easier for us to strengthen the universality of human rights. Thank you.
Yeah, if I just follow up on that too, I think it's such an important point, because being here in Singapore now, I'm more exposed to the whole idea of, is there an Asian way? In fact, we recently had a meeting about trying to look at international law. Is there an Asian, way of international law? But you're so right. It's not focusing on the differences, but really bringing home the message. This is part. This is. I think you really, that message is a very important and powerful one. And what can we do to get that across more? Because human rights in this region is kind of a question mark.
Exactly.
But anyway, I know we have a question, but can I say, Patricia, I think we need to have a roundtable on this. I think you really laid out for us some thinking here, how we can follow up, because it's so important. But we hear, and I know Patricia had her second question, but let's, I'm going to take this question from someone in our audience. Sudhir Varma, thank you, Professor, for the lecture. In quotes, You said values were presumed to be completely absent before the colonial period, end quote. However, the current value system of the West proposes the world order to be more reductivist and is increasingly becoming all persuasive against the interests of the third world. What should the strategy of the third world writers be to block such efforts? So what's the strategy? First of all, do you agree with this? And second, should there be a strategy?
Well, the strategy is basically promoting, cementing, strengthening the liberal global order established after the United Nations Charter was adopted. So basically, many people say that we must believe in some kind of hybrid political order. But I am one of those who say that liberal world order was established when the United Nations was established. And within that liberal order, we can find ways of strengthening both the universality of human rights, protecting the dignity of each and every individual around the globe. And the strategy basically, in terms of practicalities, continue to give the momentum to the decolonization of curriculum around the globe, including more diverse sources in terms of teaching and research. And I hope my book will also make a contribution to that effect. It already has received quite a sort of encouraging positive feedback from intellectuals from around the globe. So, unearthing our past rather than just, believing in what we have been told, that all these developments took place after the colonization period. Economic prosperity of the Western world meant that everything the West was doing was right, is the idea that has dominated the political discourse. Therefore, what I'm arguing here, let's go back in the distant past and trace the civilization development of different values in different civilizations, and unearthing the state practice of the distant past would enlighten many people. I quoted a distinguished scholar, a scholar of history of nations, Alexander Witch. He has published a fascinating work in the British Yearbook of International Law and Hague Academy lectures. And whatever he has argued on the basis of documents, evidence he gathered during his time in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So that kind of work we could promote and include in the curriculum around the globe. I think that will be a contribution in terms of practical strategy to strengthen the universality of human rights and making people aware of different traditions and their contribution to the development of the Western political thought in general and human rights in particular.
Yeah, wonderful. And I know Patricia had a second question about nature. It's a good question. And I think Patricia, should she repeat it? Do you want to repeat your question, or is it fine for you, Professor?
It's fine for me. I'm sorry. I seem to have forgotten to answer your second question. Yes, indeed. As I said, in very many religions, especially in Hinduism and Buddhism, worshipping of nature. For instance, when a Hindu wakes up in the morning, the first thing they say, please, Earth, Mother Earth, please forgive us for whatever we will be doing today. Before we sort of carry out our activities, which will result in pollution, some degree of pollution, some degree of harm to the environment every day, but just a prayer. Actually, many Hindus, at least in my family tradition, in the morning, we pray to nature. We pray to Mother Earth, saying that please forgive us for the sort of harm we will be causing during the day. That's how it is. And, you may have heard of Mount Everest. The Sherpas, other people who live high up in the Himalayan belt, they regard Mount Everest and other mountains as abodes of God. That's out of respect for nature. And in Hinduism, big rivers are worshipped. You may have heard of the expression Mother Ganga, Mother Ganges. It's not that people worship water, but it's a lifeline, respecting. Even, people, joke about, oh, Hindus worship cows. It's not worshipping cow. The utility of the animal, the people depended in the distant past. What they had in their possession, the most precious possession was cow, which gave milk for you to sustain, and so many other benefits from the animal. Therefore, in Hinduism and Buddhism, worshipping nature and then mountains, rivers, and other sources of water, not to pollute them. Regarding them, because if you say, oh, don't pollute them, there is a scientific reason, people may not necessarily abide by it. But if you say it's required by religion, then people are more likely to respect that rule. That's the reason people in antiquity developed the idea that to protect the environment, to protect the sources of water, especially major international water courses, you say, well, Mother Ganges, that means, oh, you should not put, of course, now it is heavily polluted, but the cleaning of the Ganges is underway. But if you go to the upper reaches of the river Ganges, it's regarded as holy. People go and take a dip. For a Hindu, taking a dip in the river Ganges is one of the things that one should do in their lifetime, just the way Hajj is for Muslim people. So there is this concept of respecting nature and the environment. Protection of the environment is deeply rooted in the Buddhist Hindu religious psyche, and that could be unearthed and included in the curriculum and advance that idea. I think that will help very much the idea of controlling the pollution and protecting the environment around the globe. Thank you.
And also, I think when we say put it in the curriculum, mainstream.
Yes.
This should really be part of the mainstream curriculum for law and human rights and environmental law, all of these, because obviously, I mean, the strong message is that these rights and values didn't start in 1945, or they've existed longer and they've been influenced, but that message really has to get across. It is so important. So I think, we need to work more towards that. Patricia, before we're almost close, but you may have some follow-up as well.
No, just again to say that, I mean, the more understanding and mainstreaming that we have of these issues, I think the better for the full understanding, because I think as you were mentioning, Professor Subedi, before, this has been used also, politically to diminish the value of human rights and the value of universality, and an historical look all over the world really demonstrates that this human rights are not the result of Western ideas, and so I think that's a very important point to avoid those pushbacks that we were mentioning before, and which I think we are witnessing in many areas of the world, and we are certainly at a difficult moment. I mean, in terms of international law in general and human rights in particular, and it's very interesting also that the examples that you gave in your own experience, because we're talking here about history and about theory, but then when you're a special rapporteur and have to deal with a country and pass these messages, it's a quite efficient way of passing the message, to say, look, your own country's history relates to these basic ideas of values underpinning human rights. So I think it's really an important approach that also should be better reflected, in academic debate and writing. So thank you again. I think this, as Nilofer said, was really an eye opener, and in the sense that more common and shared approach is certainly very, very beneficial. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Patricia. That message has come across very strong. And I think we do tend to adopt that cultural relativism, and it's not correct. And I think you've just highlighted that and painted that so clearly on the canvas. And that message has to go through, because we are living in a very delicate time in history. And we really need to promote those values, actually, protection of life, protection of different views, diversity, tolerance, because we seem to be going the other way. And it shouldn't be seen as just the values of one system or one belief. So I think we have to follow up on this really seriously, maybe around your book. And I'm quite, we'll be seeing each other. So I think this is something we'll talk about in more detail. Yes. But we thank you really for this truly very enlightening and I would say thought-provoking in many ways lecture that we will follow up on, and I hope our participants enjoyed it equally. And again, I know that others, the video will be out, others will watch this. But thank you so much for spending time with us today, and we look forward to the next encounter.
Thank you so much to both of you for your very interesting observations, and then for giving me the opportunity to share my ideas with you and a wider audience. I think we have to continue with our endeavor to promote the message that human rights are truly universal. I'm not saying that they are not, Western values. They are, of course, from the time of Magna Carta, English Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of Human Rights, and the American Declaration, so on and so forth. Codification of human rights is very much a Western-led process. That for sure is there. From humanism, all this enlightenment, from the time human rights has evolved through the centuries with the practice in very many Western countries. But they are also supported by the values of Eastern civilization. Exactly. That's all I'm saying. There are also elements of human rights in other traditions that we need to understand and appreciate. That will strengthen the universality of human rights. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful
Thank
conclusion.
you.
All right. Thank
Bye
you to all of you who joined us
bye.
today.
Bye.